Book 3, Chapter 25. Lieutenant Henry returns to the front, where he is told by the Major that the summer has been bad for the Italian forces. Henry is reunited with Rinaldi, and the two friends go to dinner at the mess, where the latter baits the priest aggressively. Commentary. In many ways, this chapter recapitulates the opening of the novel. Again, it is autumn, and, quote, "the trees were all bare and the roads were muddy," unquote. Rinaldi still torments the priest. Two things have changed, however: the fortunes of the Italian troops and Lieutenant Henry himself. Of the latter, Rinaldi observes, quote, "You act like a married man," unquote. Hemingway here employs the character of Rinaldi as a kind of foil or contrast to Henry. Henry departed the front due to his injury and has matured as a result of the love he shares with Daryl Barclay. Rinaldi, left behind, has grown increasingly bitter and hostile due to the stress of the war. Quote, "This war is killing me," unquote, he says, and the statement may be more than metaphorical. Rinaldi believes he has contracted syphilis, a terminal illness, presumably from sex with prostitutes. Again, the author links sex and death via war. Chapter 26. In Lieutenant Henry's room after dinner, he and the priest discuss the war. Commentary. This chapter, written mainly in untagged dialogue, serves primarily as an index of Lieutenant Henry's growth. Near the end of their talk, Henry agrees with the priest when the latter says, quote, "I don't believe in victory any more," unquote. Henry still asserts that he doesn't believe in defeat either, and yet he suggests philosophically that defeat, quote, "may be better," unquote. The Henry at the novel's opening was incapable of such a statement. The priest too has changed, quote, "surer of himself," unquote, now than when Henry left the front. Chapter 27. Lieutenant Henry reconnoitres the area. That night the Austrians, and, as later becomes evident, the Germans, begin an offensive, bombarding the Italian forces and eventually breaking through the Italian lines near Caporetto. The Italians begin to retreat, and the ambulance drivers prepare to travel to Pordenone, beyond the Tagliamento River. Commentary. The entry of the Germans is a turning point in the narrative. Lieutenant Henry tells us, quote, "The word Germans was something to be frightened of. We did not want to have anything to do with the Germans," unquote. The mountains-plains dichotomy is further developed, as Henry tells the driver named Gino that he does not believe a war can be fought and won in the mountains. Thus the mountains emerge here not only as a place of purity versus the corruption of the plains, but as a place of refuge as well. This will be important later in the story. Quote, "What has been done this summer cannot have been done in vain," unquote, Gino tells Henry. He refers to the fighting, but the statement has a double meaning for the reader, applying to the love shared by Henry and Daryl Barclay as well. One long paragraph in this chapter summarizes Henry's character and a theme of the novel. Quote, "I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain," unquote, Henry tells us. Quote, "Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hello were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates," unquote. The words Henry mentions, which he might have used himself at the story's beginning, now ring hollow as a result of his actual wartime experience. Hemingway has struggled in A Farewell to Arms to write a new kind of war story, and here he makes that effort explicit. This paragraph explicitly states the writer's stylistic credo as well. Throughout his writing career, Hemingway always favored the concrete over the abstract, the specific over the vague, and his radical preference for the concrete and the specific remains perhaps his greatest stylistic legacy, far more influential than his use of a limited vocabulary or simple and/or compound rather than complex sentences. Notice that it rains almost continuously during this chapter. during which the tide turns and the Italians begin to retreat in the face of the Austrian-German onslaught. The rain turns to snow one evening, holding out hope that the offensive will cease, but it quickly melts and the rain resumes. During a discussion among the drivers about the wine they are drinking with dinner, the driver named Aimo says, quote, "Tomorrow maybe we drink rainwater," unquote. Hemingway has by this time developed the rain symbolism to such a degree that the reader experiences a genuine sense of foreboding. Chapter 28. The ambulance drivers retreat from the enemy attack in a long, slow-moving column of vehicles. They pick up 2 Italian engineer sergeants and 2 teenage girls. Falling asleep in the car, Lieutenant Henry dreams of Catherine Barclay. Finally, the ambulances pull off the main road and stop at an abandoned farmhouse where Henry and the others scavenge breakfast. Commentary. In Hemingway's description of the retreat from Caporetto, he focuses on the concrete and specific, a sewing machine in the back of a cart, for instance. In terms of the narrative, the 2 Italian sergeants picked up by one of the ambulances will prove central in the story to come. Innocuous seeming at first, they begin to appear sinister at chapter's end. When it appears they haven't shared their breakfast with the others at the abandoned farmhouse. Lieutenant Henry's alienation from the cause is emphasized by the sergeant's disbelief that he is not Italian-American. Instead, he is described as, quote, North American English, unquote, which reminds the reader of his bond with the British Catherine Barclay. Indeed, Lieutenant Henry thinks and then dreams of her, a reminder of the novel's love angle, as well as a recapitulation of the Joycean stream of consciousness style that Hemingway employs periodically. Quote, "A retreat was no place for 2 virgins," unquote, Henry tells the reader, subtly reminding us of Hemingway's love, sex, war, death continuum. Someone with no sexual experience is especially vulnerable in wartime, the writer seems to be telling us. Of course, everyone is vulnerable, as Henry reminds the reader midway through the chapter. If the weather clears, a slow-moving column of vehicles will be pitifully unprotected from the bombs of enemy planes. From the safety and security of the American hospital in Milan, we have been transported in a few short chapters to a life and death situation. Chapter 29. When one of the ambulances becomes stuck in the mud, the 2 sergeants refuse to assist in the effort to dislodge it and instead try to strike out on their own. Henry orders them to halt, and when they continue walking, Henry fires, wounding one. The ambulance driver, Bonello, uses Henry's pistol to finish the job. The group abandons all 3 ambulances and sets out on foot. Commentary. Chapter 29 features one of the story's most dramatic and significant turning points in Lieutenant Henry's shooting the deserting Italian sergeant. This is the first time in this war novel that the protagonist has fired a shot, using the pistol bought with Catherine Barclay on their last night together. And yet he fires the gun at a member of his own side rather than at an enemy. The irony will intensify in the next chapter, as Henry himself stands on the verge of being shot for desertion. The discipline of the front is replaced by a ragged retreat, and now the situation verges on complete disorder. Again, Hemingway emphasizes the difference between this war and those of myth and legend. The ambulance driver, Piani, suggests that the cavalry will appear, to which Henry replies, quote, "I don't think they've got any cavalry," unquote. Note in particular that the mud introduced in the first chapter of the novel has returned as a kind of antagonist here. It is responsible for the disabling of the ambulances, which in turn leads to the death of the deserting officer. And yet, the story is no less exciting for its lack of old-time heroics. Hemingway increases the tension in this chapter by telling us that enemy planes have passed overhead en route to bombing the road where the column of retreat is moving, and later in the chapter, Henry thinks he hears firing in the distance. Chapter 30. Hiking toward Udine, The ambulance drivers, Lieutenant Henry, Aimo, Bonello, and Piani, spot German soldiers. Aimo is shot to death, presumably by Italians firing in error. Bonello flees to surrender to the Germans. Finally, having crossed the Tagliamento River, Henry observes that Italian officers are being shot by the military police for deserting their troops. He also fears being taken for a German spy. He dives into the river, deserting the Italian army. Commentary. This chapter serves as the climax of the novel, a point of no return, after which all the action is, in a sense, downhill. First, we saw Italian soldiers shot by their superior, Lieutenant Henry, because they were deserting. Here, Aimo is shot by his compatriots by accident, out of fear and incompetence. At chapter's end, Italian soldiers are shooting other Italian soldiers at random, simply because the latter are officers. Chaos is on the loose. Therefore, and because Hemingway has been preparing us for this moment from the scene early in the novel when the English nurse was puzzled by his very membership in the Italian army, we do not question Lieutenant Henry's decision to desert. As he tells Bonello, quote, "We are in more danger from Italians than from Germans," unquote. Indeed, at the end of chapter 30, it is all but certain that if he does not flee, Henry will be executed by the Italian military police. He really has no choice. Also, Henry's loyalty has never been to the Italian army at large anyway, but rather to those individuals with whom he has lived and worked. The ambulance group having disbanded, he feels he has no obligation to continue on behalf of the cause, which is, after all, an abstraction. Note the theme of declaring a separate peace. As verbalized by the Italian soldiers who think they can end the war by throwing away their rifles, it sounds naive and foolish. It will prove to be so by the end of the novel. Notice also the reliance of the military police on words like sacred soil and fruits of victory, precisely the abstractions that Henry told us a few chapters back that he mistrusts. Quote, "Have you ever been in a retreat?" unquote, asks the lieutenant colonel who is about to be shot. A retreat is concrete and specific. It is something real. The lofty terms used by the MPs are proof that they haven't had the sort of experience that Henry has gained over the course of the novel. Chapter 31. Despite a powerful current, Frederick, no longer Lieutenant Henry, manages to swim ashore. He crosses part of the Venetian plain on foot. He boards a moving train, hiding among guns stored beneath a tarpaulin. Commentary. This chapter is mainly connective. Notice, however, that Frederick Henry's desertion is illustrated with concrete specifics. Gunless now, he pulls the insigniae from the sleeves of his uniform. Hemingway's masterful way with action manifests itself at the start of chapter 31, and when Henry boards the train. Also note the author's curious use of you and we in what is otherwise a first-person singular I narration. While swimming, Henry describes himself as you, and then we. The effect is of close identification with the reader, of our implication in his actions even. We are all Frederick Henry, Hemingway seems to be implying. Chapter 32. Frederick Henry lies hidden amid the guns beneath the canvas covering the train car, and thinks about deserting, and about Catherine Barclay. Commentary. Book 3 ends quietly, with Frederick Henry's thoughts rendered in a Joycean stream of consciousness style. Note the use again of the second-person point of view in the narration. Henry justifies his desertion to himself, the desertion that, in a sense, he has been rationalizing from the start of the novel. Quote, "You are out of it now," unquote, he thinks. Quote, "You had no more obligation," unquote. This, of course, is the episode that gives the novel its title, a bit ironically, considering that it takes place on a train car transporting guns. It is typical of Hemingway's heroes not to bear grudges, and Henry is no exception. quote, "Anger was washed away in the river along with any obligation," unquote, he tells us. As the story continues, he will bear the Italians no ill will, or if he feels any resentment, he will at least refrain from expressing it. Parted the front due to his injury, and has matured as a result of the love he shares with Catherine Barclay. Rinaldi, left behind, has grown increasingly bitter and hostile due to the stress of the war. Quote, "This war is killing me," unquote, he says, and the statement may be more than metaphorical. Rinaldi believes. Commentary. In many ways, this chapter recapitulates the opening of the novel. Again, it is autumn, and, quote, "the trees were all bare and the roads were muddy," unquote. Rinaldi still torments the priest. Two things have changed. Book 3, Chapter 25. Lieutenant Henry returns to the front, where he is told by the Major that the summer has been bad for the Italian forces. Henry is reunited with Rinaldi, and the two friends go to dinner at the mess, where the latter baits the priest aggressively, however. The fortunes of the Italian troops and Lieutenant Henry himself. Of the latter, Rinaldi observes, quote, "You act like a married man," unquote. Hemingway here employs the character of Rinaldi as a kind of foil or contrast to Henry. Henry believes he has contracted syphilis, a terminal illness, presumably from sex with prostitutes. Again, the author links sex and death via war. Chapter 26. In Lieutenant Henry's room after dinner, he and the priest discuss the war.